It's interesting to be here on behalf of Broadband Forum because obviously network transformation is the heart of this conference. And as Broadband Forum, of course, being originally the DSL forum, we know a thing or two about transformation as we go through this process. But as we step into our topics for today, I'm really here to do a couple of things. One is to really give you a brief idea of some of the activities that are going around on at Broadband Forum right now with regard to 5G and how that is related to overall network transformation for our members and those sorts of things. And basically to really get you, give you some visibility into all the exciting things that are going on around Broadband Forum in this area right now. Because as I said, a lot of folks think back and think, well, gosh, Broadband Forum, they were really active in pushing DSL, et cetera, and making that a success. But now here we are at 1 billion broadband installations around the world. TR69 is everywhere. The foundations of TR101 and those sorts of things have actually now moved on to entirely different and new activities in and around the forum itself and in many of your networks. And ultimately, I think that all this comes to a head with 5G and it being actually a catalyst to network transformation. And the reason, of course, being that we really, from Broadband Forum perspective, see this as really holistic broadband, right? Where you actually have had historically all these different silos, you have all these different technologies, you have the meeting points of standards and open source that we've been talking about, really coming together and creating the opportunity to drive something really exceptional with the advent of 5G in the coming years here. And we're going to walk you through some of the things that are addressing that head on. So with that said, let me give you a brief idea of for those of you who don't know, any of the service providers I've seen here I recognize already members of the forum. We basically are really a leading organization in terms of pushing forward the broadband industry overall, from an ecosystem perspective, from a standards perspective, and basically from an innovation perspective. We have basically any large service provider really around the world is already a member. Most large vendors are also members in parts of the ecosystem that fill and help make that innovation possible. And we have a lot of emerging companies right now that are becoming very active, taking active roles in this because the initiatives we have built around open source right now, as well as just exciting things around quality of service in broadband, some of the things that are going on in the connected home and so forth. Let me talk a little bit about some of the areas of focus for us right now, just to give you a sense of why we're here talking about 5G. We really see broadband as having 4 major components, and this is how all of our projects are structured today, around 5G, around connected home, around cloud and access technologies. Each of these, of course, interacting with one another and reinforcing one another, but by the same token, also going down the path of their separate layers of innovation. And although today we're going to be talking about 5G, as we look at all the other aspects of this going forward with regard to the fundamental infrastructure that's required to get 5G out and running the network, the transport that's involved with that, the virtualization that will be necessary for agilely getting advanced services out, not only across a common network, not a bunch of different disparate networks, and of course what has to go on in the connected home and making sure that you can have a converged service experience across the wireless and wireline. So just even residential gateways that fundamentally recognize both networks at the same time. All these are things and projects we're actively involved with right now and are driving us forward. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the revolution around 5G. I'm going to do a little bit of mom and apple pie to get us all excited about 5G for the next couple slides here, just to remind us why we're all here, right? Then we'll get into the details of what actually some of the projects that are going on. But think about the revolution of 5G. I actually saw a really funny statistic the other day, which is every day there are 100 articles that are generated around the world just focused on 5G. And 5G in and of itself, from 2017 to 18, had a 250% increase in the number of articles, right? So, not only is it in front of us, but it keeps gaining more and more momentum, and yet by the same token, no one really knows exactly what it is, right? There's all sorts of different ideas as to what 5G could be, what it can be. People are saying we're deploying it now. Okay, we'll get into some of the details of that in a minute. But there's all sorts of interesting things, and claiming, of course, that it's a revolutionary step. Let's look at this statistic really quickly. 37 million 5G enabled handsets in 2019, 525 by 2023. Interesting projections, right? And obviously gives you a sense of what we're looking at there, about 14-time increase in terms of overall scale just over the course of the next 5 years or so. Huge implications, both in terms of scale, in terms of the traffic that those things are going to have to be driving and managing, and that's just starting to scratch the surface. If we think about this from the residential environment and the fixed mobile environment, from the mission critical comms environment, and autonomous vehicles and drones, and even from the scale of really the industrial and smart building and smart city applications around 5G. All these things are going to be amazing services, right, that are promised, but ultimately they have really huge implications on the network. Individually, unique implications. Some of scale, right? Some of rapid services, some of reliability and latency and those sorts of things. So all of this has to somehow get integrated back into the overall service offering itself. And then when you think about it, you've all seen a million of these types of pictures. The world enabled by 5G, that is the dream, looks cool, right? But ultimately it has to come down to really what is the infrastructure that's driving this. And as you make that leap from 4G to 5G, when you're looking at typical 4G tower coverage, 25 square miles, and you start thinking about that in terms of the antennas that would be required, depending on how you calculate this to support a real 5G deployment, you're talking about, really an antenna every 150 meters. It's a huge difference. What's the foundation sitting underneath that? And that's what we're here to address today. Not just that 5G is a revolution in terms of services and what the opportunity is, but it's also important to think of it in terms of an evolution in driving basically driving the ability to get from where you are today as a service provider, right, to where you want to be and need to be with regard to 5G from a whole bunch of different starting points. And that's going to be an important thing to happen. So let's talk about what that means from an implication perspective in terms of that holistic component that we're talking about. The promise of 5G really, if you start thinking about it in terms of how even the wireless industry had stepped back and looked at their next generation mobile focus, it is really to converge these networks into one single network that's efficient, both in terms of service delivery as well as in terms of rapidly getting services up and operating. But historically, these companies have all operated in silos. And ultimately, the idea is to get this all converged into one overall infrastructure. So let's talk about how this fits in from a broadband forum perspective. We really have a number of different overall focus areas that are built around this catalyst of 5G right now. One is the 5G fixed mobile convergence, right, which is basically our really working not only through the handoffs that are going to exist in terms of pulling the wireless and the wireline networks together, but literally giving the instructions into 3GPP to let them know from our perspective, the folks that are actually focused on the ecosystems, know how to build the networks, that are fundamentally have been the builders and drivers of the standards around the wireline networks, what's going to be necessary from a hooks and perspective to basically go and address this from a converged wireless wireline perspective going forward. The second area that we're really focused on is 5G fixed access and transport, right? And that is a related but separate question, which is if you want to basically look to leverage either your existing 5G core, right, and ultimately, deliver the necessary bandwidth and latency requirements, et cetera, to be able to serve 5G. What does that look and feel like, and what are the details that have to be worked through in order to deliver that? And last but not least, of course, it's 5G applied to the above, network slicing and time-critical applications. Again, very related, but we do have different project areas that are built around that. And I'm going to go through deeper dives now on the 5G fixed mobile convergence side, and then I'm going to do the same thing in the 5G transport side. So what is the scope and purpose of our 5G FMC projects? Well, basically, as I mentioned before, it's really to find those key connection points between the 5G core and the wireline access networks to ensure that there's basically a semblance of overlap as we get into the full implementation of a converged network. It is, as I mentioned, to provide that firm feedback into this 3GPP. By the way, that work has already happened. There was a press release that was issued basically in the early part of this year where we actually had done the formal handoff, and we are still meeting very actively and working through the details with 3GPP in terms of how that ultimately translates into basically what their implementation recommendations will be at near the end of the year. And then from getting in more details, a specification of wireline equipment in which we basically that meet those specifications going forward. So as far as just a holistic view of what we're trying to do, right? This is, this whole idea of making this wireline access and 5G core network work as seamlessly as possible together, right? And as we're doing that, putting the hooks in place so that there's a rapid and smooth migration to getting to that point, right? And of course, one of the interesting components of this is making sure that we do so in a manner that that basically allows not just one starting place, right? But a starting place for new operators, existing operators, and everybody that sits in between, right? Where their network sits, how far they are down the path of virtualization and software-defined networking, where they stay in the path of copper to fiber. I mean, all sorts of different things you can imagine. And tackling these is the foundational focus of this from that level. Getting down to the overall architecture level, this is a network that you all have seen before. If you look at the 5G core network on the far, to my far left, that is the domain of 3GPP, right? Everything that starts moving here to the left, most of that area is areas that the Broadband Forum has been very, very active in over the course of the last couple of decades, from residential to the through BNG and all the different aspects of how you manage and deliver overall broadband services. And so ultimately, what we're focused on in this fixed mobile convergence is a couple key things. One is the access gateway function, right? The AGF function, which basically is our layer two, our activities in getting those specifications built out around the layer 2 activities in the network. The second is in that far side is the fixed mobile inter networking function, right? Which basically is, again, same sort of hooks and all, but on the layer from a layer 3 perspective. And then don't forget, as I mentioned earliest in the presentation, there's these residential gateway and CPE management issues, right? Where you basically have to have things that are going on in the customer or business home, right? Where they basically have to recognize and understand what's a wireless service, what's a wireline service, make it completely invisible to the subscriber, and make it, of course, billable and easily provisionable and those sorts of things at the same time. So from an individual document perspective, SD 407 is the foundational document for a lot of this work from a fixed mobile convergence perspective. We meet on this document every 2 weeks, right? And continue to refine and revise it going forward. There are spur documents related to that, network end slicing, and of course a lot of normative work in working texts around the access gateway functions, the fixed mobile interfaces, the cups, et cetera, that are all going on at any given point in time. The reason I just wanted to point this out to you is that these are all active projects going on right now in Broadband Forum. If any of you are not involved or want to get folks in your company involved and interested, come to our website, come talk to me. We'll figure out how to get that going forward. But again, it's there's a lot of activity, a lot of excitement, a lot of work going on in the space, and we're really excited about the progress that has been made to date in doing this. Of course, it's a big challenge, right? But to some extent, we feel like we've been pretty much keeping up with the pace of what expectations are, and certainly had got what we needed to into 3GPP on time. And our meetings with them have been going very well over the course of the last couple of months. So just a quick summary of the convergence projects. Really. I hadn't mentioned this yet, but the NGMN 5G vision from the wireless side really also views this as a converged network service. Both the wireline and wireless industries see this as the goal, and we're actually out there actively pursuing and going down that path. Our work is really built around making these common interfaces, and ultimately from the major areas of focus are in those interfaces and functions, end-to-end slicing, as well as overall transport. And speaking of transport, let's go into that component really quickly. 5G transport, we talked about what the drivers are right now in a number of different areas. I think that we certainly have succeeded in getting a lot of work done in this space that basically, is going to be a huge challenge for service providers going forward. Fundamentally, as you think about just, wearable, smart homes, industry process, that's just the start of what transport is providing today. If you start to layer on the 5G capabilities of not only the speed requirements, the low latency requirements, all that promise that I talked to earlier, you end up running into some really daunting and yet, important challenges. And of course, we've been doing a lot of the foundational work in making sure that that the inputs are there for that. By the way, I didn't mention both these projects were actually founded by service provider members. So to that end, if you look back at the fixed mobile convergence project, it started in 2016 by having, you can think, imagine yourselves, the biggest operators in the world coming to us and saying, hey, we need you to be working with 3GPP to make sure that we can take our existing infrastructures and do this, or if we want to, we can go CLEC in a new market and go do overbuild and do that sort of activity. So that is what we've been working through in terms of the driving of this. The same is true on the transport projects, right? The service provider driven, they've come, they said, hey, we see this coming down the road, we need you to go and address it head on. They're active in the projects, and we're just basically putting our arms around and coordinating that activity. Let me kind of jump into this. This is a really high-level view if you think about today's 3G and 4G networks, and then thinking about the extra layers of complexity when you think about the stringent performance requirements that are going to be part of a 5G network, both in splitting of backhaul and front haul, the SIPRI issues, and just fundamentally, the extra challenges that will have to be addressed in terms of addressing that issue. By the way, if you see me looking to my left a lot, my screen went out here a long time ago, so trying to see what the slides are saying here. From a 5G transport strategy perspective, leveraging, we're really looking at this in a couple different ways. Obviously, folks are starting from different places, trying to help them leverage what exists and migrates, and of course, giving that opportunity, as I mentioned before, to forklift and replace, right? We haven't, there are a lot of service providers who have come to us and said, hey, 5G is a really unique opportunity for me. I want to be able to perhaps not just go back and build the old and add on to the old network. I am certainly entertaining opportunities to go and build the new. And ultimately, this is that's I think creates a little bit of excitement. I think that I think the foundation, some of the questions that happened earlier about what why are big guys not moving and why is innovation perhaps not happening? Well, I think some of the big guys are thinking in ways that may not necessarily be open, right, to what everyone else is seeing in parts of the industry. So again, just trying to keep this going forward quickly. Let's talk about what happens in the transport today versus transport of the future. We really have been applying an 80-20 rule. And when you think about 5G deployments that you're seeing today, these active trials that are going on, most of them are actually based on existing transport, right? Because the current transport network has VPNs, has IP scalability, has MPLS convergence, right? But in order to get to the promise of 5G that we were talking about before, you have to go out there and really address the time-sensitive issues. You have to address the the DetNet issues, the FlexE, where you're basically, honestly, you're actually taking the advantage of the old ATM network and applying it into a new environment, right? All of these things have to be addressed head on in order to make this work. And basically, this is almost a laundry list of the individual areas that we're actively working through right now to go and head these off in terms of individual projects that are going and addressing it from a transport perspective. So why is the forum involved with this? I mean, as I said, we started out the DSL forum. We actually had some time where we merged actually over time with MPLS forum and those things over time, which really got our feet wet in terms of the transport areas. But we've been at the center of this for a long time. We have a lot of history of expertise, a lot of key stakeholders, obviously a lot of key service provider drivers that are in our domain, and we have a lot of cool tools, right, that are basically allowing us to agilely work across this ecosystem and drive a lot of this forward. And as we then move into the 5G transport space, again, just from looking at it from a transport perspective purely, and then the deterministic transport components of time sensitivity, DetNet overall, and FlexE. As well as network slicing, we're actually hitting this head on. So, just a quick summary. I didn't want to take any more time because I know we were behind running into this, but ultimately I think you already understand the drivers of what's driving our 5G transport work. The service providers came to us and asked us to go and address this head on, and we have been. And fundamentally, of course, 5G doesn't work without this being solved, right? So it had to be addressed in some way aggressively. So from a timing perspective, this is the reference point that we have been using ever since 2016 when these folks first came to us and were asked to go take a look at both fixed mobile convergence in transport. Here we are in 2019. We've already made the handoff to 3GPP. We're really working with them actively as they get into their meetings. I heard some folks talking about Brazil coming up this summer, as well as other activities coming up this fall. From our perspective, I think we're keeping pretty close to the time frame on that. That said, we're one part of the ecosystem overall, so I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone else. But we're really looking at a cadence right now where you're looking at really true 2020 trials, right? And what I mean true with transport networks, et cetera, that basically are built on some of the principles we talked about. And then, of course, 2021 and the latter half of that year, where we're actually looking at real commercial deployments and then mass deployment in probably 22 or around then. Just to give you a sense of what we're seeing timing-wise right now. So, we talked about the different silos and whether 5G is a catalyst for transformation. I mean, obviously, it's all these things being consolidated into one. Absolutely, we're excited about what we're seeing in the network right now, and ultimately, are believers in its possibility. I did want to mention that if you want to get into more details, since we do have a quick conference coming up in June in The Hague, and where we'll be delving into these issues and more. So, with that said, I don't know if there are some questions that folks have, or what time constraints are. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that enlightening presentation. I was not aware that Broadband Forum was doing anything related to 5G. I would like to suggest that you concentrate all your efforts on ITU Study Group 15. They already have specs. I think actual approved recommendations. I'll have to check my own website for 5G transport in a metropolitan area. And also you should forget about IEEE, the company I'm representing, because they will not do anything that's productive.
Okay, well.
And they already know I'm sort of the bad man at IEEE for saying that, but I'm on record as saying that.
Understood. Well, I mean, the reality too, of course, we obviously have formal liaison processes with all the different organizations, but I'll take that back and make sure that the folks are aware. Sure. I'd be happy to look at it. I got to tell you, I'm not familiar at the.
Driven by the Chinese.
Understood. Other questions, comments, concerns? Yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to understand the process. So the Broadband Forum has probably had a liaison with 3GPP ongoing, I'm assuming,
yes,
through all the other generations of work that's happened on the previous Gs, right? Mm-hmm. And then one thing I don't understand is when the work is formally given to 3GPP, how is it taken forward from there? I mean, aren't some of the players common? I would imagine there are people at the BBF that are also at 3GPP and vice versa.
You're absolutely correct. Some of the players are common, right? There are, I will say that the expertise of a lot of the players that are at Broadband Forum is a bit unique in terms of the types of use cases that they go and address, right? The history that they're bringing to it in terms of, how obviously a history of wireline deployment experience with, billion deployments, et cetera, right, is coming to bear. And that said, there are common folks, right, that are involved with both entities, but that's the gap that's being bridged between the two, is really bringing that extra expertise in. Now, once those requirements are there, as I mentioned, we have constant meetings going on. It's funny, they actually change weekly. Mostly they've been every 2 weeks. But if there's something really hairy coming up, they actually will consolidate them and have them on a more frequent basis.
Yeah.
But to work out these individual aspects of things that are trying to meet the time schedules of getting 3GPP to its point of issuing its own specifications.
Right, that was my...
Ours are suggestions, right? But they're informed suggestions. We've been working with them on to make sure that they get it, right?
Yeah, that's what my thing was. Because if the document is just handed over, then who shepherds it within 3GPP can become a real issue.
We continue to work with them, and there's a lot of give and take process in terms of that going forward between that entity. And of course, that same thing happens with a lot of the other organizations too. It's just really the art of these standards bodies is identifying who's working where, right, and where those crossovers and boundaries lie.
Thank you, Geoff.
Yeah, thank you very much.